So, The Lost Metal Part 2. This one is interesting because not a ton actually happens here, weirdly enough. This is a very short section in terms of actual like forward progression of events. Really, there's like 3 scenes in this entire part. It's just the encounter with the brief encounter, like combat encounter with the set in Bilming, and then the scene in the Bilming jail with the mayor and Marsh, and then the hunt for clues as the group sort of goes out and looks for it. Charitably, you could say 4 scenes because the hunt for clues is kind of in 2 separate phases, where first they find the house of the guy who's been murdered, and then they find the woman he was confiding in. But it's interesting because it's sort of similar to the previous book, actually. Something that was interesting about the Bands of Mourning structurally is that parts 1 and 2 were both really brief and just kind of setting up the massive sort of chunk of book that was part 3. And that's even more the case here, because actually, in terms of the length of the book, part 3, or at least whatever, I don't actually know if there's more than 3 parts, but as of the end of part 2, the remainder of the book is like half the book. As opposed to just like a climax like it was in the first 2 books. Like the first 2 books had relatively short part 3s. So yeah, it's interesting. I wonder if I'll have to split my video for part 3 into 2 parts, into 2 videos. Yeah, let's. So I'm not really going to talk about what the events here as much because they're not that interesting. That's not a bad thing. They're just sort of the plot moving forward in fairly predictable ways. There weren't really any major surprises. But there were a lot of really interesting reveals that I want to talk about. There's a lot of Cosmere stuff going on here, and I want to talk about that a bit more later, actually. So, let's start with some really fun new applications of the Scadrian magic system. One of the things we see here is the idea of using the potential of hemalurgy to essentially create custom Metalborn with like a custom set of powers. Using hemalurgy to essentially create custom-made counter warriors for specific people. Like we see the woman who was essentially literally built in a lab specifically to counter Wayne and for nothing else. And I'm pretty sure that the implication is that the coin shot that Wax fights in this scene is also basically meant to be like a personal counter to him. Which is not something that I really thought about as something that hemalurgy would allow you to do. In part because hemalurgy previously was mostly used in Mistborn Era 1, where you had full Mistborn, and so individuals didn't really have such stark differences in what powers they had available to them. And so both most natural Metalborn in Era 1, at least among the major characters, and most hemalurgists, which is really just the Inquisitors, were essentially full Mistborn. But here we have this interesting, like it's kind of like having character classes. It's a bit video gamey in a way, but in a way that I like and that makes sense within the setting and was sort of naturally built up to over time as the magic system was developed over what is now 7 books. 8 if you count Secret History. Which you probably should. That's actually a pretty large novella. Yeah, so that was cool. Then what comes up, oh right, before that actually, we had a very fascinating encounter with a character named Moonlight. So Moonlight is the character from part 1 who Marasi saw through her speed bubble, leaving a message, who it very quickly became clear was a member of the Ghost Bloods. And now we've learned a bit more about her. We've gotten to know her. She's actually joined the team for presumably the remainder of this book. And she is interesting. The reason she is interesting is because she doesn't want Wax to know about her. She specifically only wants Marasi. Now, I've already predicted that Marasi is going to be recruited for the Ghost Bloods by the end of this book, and that is now basically set in stone. It's very, very blatantly being foreshadowed in this part of the book in particular, that where Marasi's story is heading is that she will be recruited for the Ghost Bloods. And I am interested to see how the Ghost Bloods are portrayed in this book, because of course, the Ghost Bloods, since given who they work for, are obviously primarily probably going to be looking out for the interests of Scadrial. And as a result, when we see the Ghost Bloods in other books, most notably in the Stormlight Archive, they are often antagonists. They are an antagonistic force. And so far, my primary exposure to the Ghost Bloods, and everyone else's obviously, has been through Shallan. And in Shallan's story, the Ghost Bloods are very much a nefarious, if not outright evil faction. They are absolutely uncontroversially antagonists in her story. But that it looks like Sanderson is actually going to do something kind of clever here, which is that's not the fact that they are antagonists in Stormlight is not meant to indicate that Kelsier is evil now, but rather that the interests of Scadrial and Roshar don't necessarily align. And so from the perspective of the Scadrian characters, maybe the Ghost Bloods are the good guys. And from the perspective of Rosharan characters, they're the bad guys. That could still turn out not to be the case. Maybe by the end of this book, the Ghost Bloods will turn out to be evil in this narrative as well. But so far, that's not my impression. And especially not if Marasi is going to join them at the end. Which I hope she does, because I think that might set up, like, interesting meetings between characters in Stormlight Era 2. Anyway, that's beside the point. What I really want to talk about here is the fact that she is hiding stuff from Wax. And why she's hiding stuff from Wax is not entirely clear to me. Because Wax knows that Kelsier is still around, thanks to the events of the last book. Thanks to the events of this book, his conversation with Marsh, he knows about the Ghost Bloods, I'm pretty sure. Or at least he has been informed that Kelsier has agents of his own. And he knows that those agents are probably on his side. He knows about most, like, relevant Cosmere stuff from Harmony. Really, I don't think there's any piece of information right now that Marasi has that Wax doesn't, except specifically the fact that Moonlight is a Ghost Blood. Which makes me wonder why she's so dedicated to hiding that. Does she think that Wax would be less likely to trust her than Marasi? I'm not sure why she would think that. The other thing that's confusing about the fact that she is a Ghost Blood is the scene later on in this part of the book where Wayne meets a guy selling street food and is sold Herdazian cuisine. which at first blush is like, oh, that's like a nice little detail for people who've read Stormlight to catch. But if you actually take it seriously and think critically about it for a moment, it's really weird. Because who was that guy? It wasn't Hoyd, because they all know Hoyd. He wouldn't pretend to be a street vendor. He'd just come up in his normal Scadrian identity, probably. So it wasn't Hoyd. They already have a ghost blood in their ranks keeping tabs on them, so why would it be a ghost blood? The Ire, as far as I know, has no reason to be on Scadrial right now. Yeah, who was that? Who was the person it wasn't Chris because Wayne said it was a man? Yeah, I don't know which. This is either a new faction of world hoppers, or I'm forgetting something. Like, there's pretty much all of the options I can think of off the top of my head for who would be there selling Herdasian street food to Wax. Pretty much all of those options just don't work. So maybe there's yet another new faction involved, or a new character. Or maybe a character or faction I know about has interests that I'm unaware of, which would explain why they're there. It's also possible that it's literally just is Lopen, like based on something that might happen in Stormlight 5. We don't know yet. But yeah, I just wanted to say that that particular detail was odd to me. What else? Well, the scene with Marsh is really interesting. Seeing Marsh again, by the way, and Marsh, like, not pretending to be Death, but Marsh acting like Marsh, being very human, was really nice. It was really like a warm embrace of nostalgia for Era 1. Which I enjoyed. I enjoyed it in the same way that I enjoyed the scene with Tensoon in the second book of Era 2. But Marsh also said something really interesting to me, which is that the symbol of the Ghost Bloods has just been Mare's flower this whole time. It's been staring all of us in the face. Which I felt like it was both like a mind-blown moment for me, and also a moment of like intense frustration with myself. Because there's no way I could have guessed that, or really I think anyone could have reasonably guessed that based on the description of the symbol. But now that it's been said, it's like, oh, yeah, of course. I didn't even make the connection after I knew Kelsier was the leader. That was a cool moment. The other cool moment, which... Actually, no, this didn't happen here. This happened in the conversation with Moonlight earlier, was the reveal that Scadrial doesn't have a moon and has never had one this whole time, which really makes me want to go back to Era 1 and like search it for any references to the moon to see if this is a retcon or if it was a long con. Like, has Sanderson been like preparing that particular incredibly minor and irrelevant reveal for like a decade at this point? Over a decade. It's been more than a decade since the Final Empire. Has he been preparing it for more than a decade? Or is this a retcon? I wonder. I do wonder. I'm gonna err on the side of him preparing it because so much stuff so far feels very pre-planned. And even stuff like Kelsier still being alive, which at the time I was sure was a retcon. In hindsight, I've kind of been sold on the idea was planned all along. So maybe Sanderson's brain just works at a higher level than the rest of us, who knows? Yeah, what else is going on here? So I do have a concern about the Cosmere as a whole that I want to express at the end, but before that I do want to talk about some of the character stuff going on here, specifically with Wax and Wayne. So I've talked about where I think Marasi's story is going. Wax's story, well, first of all, Wax is definitely a full Mistborn now. Like, it hasn't been revealed yet, but he saw like allomantic lines leading to metal even when he wasn't burning steel, which my theory was that he was actually burning iron and he just couldn't recognize it. And now there's like a fight scene where he punches a guy real hard and then he like notes that the blows don't hurt his knuckles as much as they once did. So he's also burning pewter now. I'm fairly confident that when that explosion happened in his basement, he actually did successfully divide harmonium, and a little bit of lerasium hit him and made him a full Mistborn. And it's just taking a while for him to figure it out. And that's also why he got like special vials of metals to drink, because I'm guessing those probably actually contain other metals and not just steel. Although now he's lost them, which is interesting. Very interesting. Interesting. I don't know what's going on there. I don't know where that's going. So yeah, first of all, Wax is definitely a Mistborn. Secondly, I'm constantly torn on whether Wax is going to survive this book. I am fairly confident Wayne is not. Well, actually, I'm 100% confident that one of these two guys is gonna die. Either Wax or Wayne is gonna die at the end of this book. And I'm leaning towards Wayne. I think Wax might actually get to have a happy ending, maybe? Like, maybe he might actually get to retire with Steris and their kids at the end of this. At least, that's the vibe I'm getting so far. Like when you read Mistborn Era 1, you sort of sense, by the time you get to the third book, you sort of have this sense of impending doom. Like, you know there's no happy ending for Vin. You can tell that Vin has the sword of Damocles hanging over her head throughout the third book. I don't feel that with Wax, necessarily. I felt that with Wax the previous book, actually, but not this one. I do feel it with Wayne, though. So let's talk about Wayne. Sanderson is doing something weird with Wayne here, which is that he's doing the I think, this is a theory, we'll see whether this turns out to be true, but I think he's doing a reverse Adolin Colin arc with Wayne, where Adolin Colin is a character who is heavily coded as a main protagonist and a hero, but then his whole arc, at least so far in Stormlight, has been about sort of accepting his role as a supporting character, like realizing that what he contributes is not being the big main hero, but rather supporting those who are. I kind of feel like where we're going with Wayne is that Wayne is heavily coded as the sidekick comic relief character, and he views himself that way, and that's all he wants to be. He is not comfortable being the main character. He desperately does not want to be the main character, because he's filled with self-loathing and guilt and feels like he doesn't deserve it. But I feel like the story is leading us towards Wayne maybe being like the central hero of this book by the end. And my gut tells me that that's going to take the form of a self-sacrifice. I could be wrong, though. Like, Sanderson has been known to really surprise me in terms of how he utilizes narrative tropes. But my gut feeling is that by this point I have a good grasp on Sanderson's style and how he forms narratives. So I feel like I sort of like, as I'm reading this book, I feel like I can sort of feel out the shape of the story in front of me. But then again, I thought I could do that halfway through the previous book as well. And then I got thrown for a wild loop with the Kelsier stuff and the Malwish stuff, and hoo boy. The other thing I want to predict is that I don't actually think the Malwish are going to play a major role in this book. So far, it feels like the Malwish are being set up as like a major threat. I think that the Malwish are being set up for Era 3, actually. My gut feeling is that this book is not... Like, this book is probably going to end on, like, maybe an ominous note in terms of the relationship between the Malwish Consortium and the Basin. But I don't think this book is going to result in, like, all-out war between them. Just yet. I do think that that conflict is probably inevitable eventually. Yeah, that's it for my predictions, really. Now I want to talk about, well, before I talk about my concern, I'm going to just mention out that this section has one of my favorite scenes ever, which is that when Marsh walks into the police station, the mayor, who previously made a big deal about how he is not a Pathian, and therefore he has no obligation to take anything Harmony says as gospel. And then Marsh, like the personification of death in the Pathian religion, walks into the room. And the mayor, like, sort of weakly tries to say, "Oh, you can't tell me what to do. I'm not of your religion." And then Marsh says, "Death is not a religion. It is a fact." That's such a cool comeback. I love that. That's some good writing right there. I love that. So, let's talk about my concern, which is that Marsh talks very openly with Wax and Wayne and Marasi in this scene about Kelsier being the leader, Kelsier being alive and a ghost, and leading the Ghost Bloods and all of that. And I think that's cool, actually. I think it's good that he talks openly about it, because I think it would be frustrating to the reader if it was like kept being teased even after we had it confirmed. But the problem is he talks about it in such a way that the scene clearly is written with the assumption that the reader already knows. Like I can see ways that this scene could have been written where it could have functioned as a good reveal for someone who hasn't read Secret History and the Stormlight books. But that's not how it was written, at least in my opinion. It was written, at least in my opinion, only with the reader who already knows in mind. Like, that's the only reader that this scene was written for. And that concerns me. Not because that in and of itself is bad, but because I have conflicting desires here. On the one hand, as someone who has been reading the Cosmere in chronological order, in release order, making the story more suited for that kind of reader the reader who already knows everything and who is following the story as it goes along, uh, is like perfectly suited for me. Like, I'm that reader. I'm the reader this is made for. But I can't help myself making comparisons with the MCU. Because the Cosmere MCU comparisons are fairly obvious, I think, to anyone who's followed both properties. Obviously, the Cosmere is not as is much less corporate than the MCU, and therefore much better in my opinion. But and also, it's all the work of a single person. But in the MCU, as I've been following the MCU over the years, I feel like the quality of the individual stories within the MCU, the individual films, has declined as the focus on the meta-narrative has increased. Phase 1 of the MCU could be watched in any order. There was basically no chronology between, like, Iron Man 1, Captain America 1, and Thor 1. Like, obviously you should watch Iron Man 2 after Iron Man 1, but there was no expectation that you watched Iron Man before Captain America. And the same is true in the Cosmere. But as the MCU built up the sort of meta-narrative, the overarching story of the MCU, sure, became more interesting and more compelling, but the individual movies stopped really working as standalone narratives. And so far, that has not happened to the Cosmere. I still very much feel that that the focus of the Stormlight books is on the narrative of the Stormlight books and on the characters of those books, and likewise the focus of the Mistborn books. But we are getting to the point where fully appreciating these works requires a level of intertextuality, which again I personally love, but I hope it doesn't get too out of hand to the point where the individual characters of the Stormlight books and the individual characters of the Mistborn books start sort of, like, their individual story arcs start suffering. I don't want major Stormlight characters to sort of have their development and arc sacrificed on the altar of advancing the Mistborn story, or vice versa. And again, there's no indication so far that that is happening. It's just something that, like, is sort of a concern in my mind with sort of meta-textual narratives like we've got going on with the Cosmere and the MCU. Because, again, these are the only real two examples I've ever seen, and it did happen with the MCU. So I'm, like, constantly on the lookout for it happening with the Cosmere. Again, I have a sample size of 1, so maybe this is not an inherent problem of metatextual narratives. Maybe it's just specifically a mishandling that Marvel did with the MCU. And I have nothing to be concerned about. It's just something I'm sort of like, whenever it happens, I'm like, ooh, where's this going? So far, it's going great, though, so don't take this as a criticism of the books, of this book. Like, so far, the currently existing Cosmere does not have this problem. It's just a vague concern for the future I have, like, as a writer and someone very concerned with, like, structuring stories. I can see the pitfalls coming. Like, I can see the potential to mess this up. And I do think this is related to my criticisms of Rhythm of War, which is that Rhythm of War focused more on plot than characters. Now, Rhythm of War focused on the plot of Rhythm of War, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that the metatextual stuff got in the way there. But this is like a larger... Like, the thing I'm concerned about here is a larger level of what I think went wrong with Rhythm of War. So we'll see how that unfolds. However, that's enough about my vague concerns about the future of the Cosmere. We have very real concerns about the future of the Cosmere to deal with, such as, is Elendel going to be nuked? So I'm gonna get to reading part 3 and find out if Elendel is going to be nuked. Very concerned about the apparent photograph of the future that Telsin has. Makes me think of Odium's powers of seeing into the future, but we know that Trell isn't connected to Odium, so like, I wonder what's going on there. We'll see. We'll see what's going on with that photo. Okay. I'm gonna go start reading part 3. Probably tonight, actually. See you next week for that.